Growing up, there was two words I always heard about the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's complicated. Rather than look too much into the issue myself, I just took other people's words for it. Why waste my time learning about something apparently so complex, especially when it was in a place halfway around the world that would never concern me? It's only when I began to actually develop the ability to have compassion for people beyond my immediate surroundings that I found myself more and more interested in actually learning about the conflict. And the more I finally began to read about Israel and Palestinians and listen to people informed about the issue, the more I realized it's actually not very complicated at all. Israel is an apartheid state with a huge power imbalance over the Palestinians. Much is made about the threat of Palestinians, and especially Hamas against Israeli people, but really they're not much of a threat at all. Since 2000, for every one Israeli killed in the conflict, almost 10 Palestinians have been. And remember, the Palestinians are also the ones consistently having their land continually stolen and occupied, and their hospitals and power grids consistently bombed. Not to mention the 15-year-long land, air, and sea blockade on Gaza, which has devastated the economy and goes far beyond just security purposes, and is really just a way of punishing the Palestinian people. It's especially hard to see people both sides issue when you've seen at this point half a dozen pictures of dead or dying Palestinian children with their heads caved in, or missing limbs, or covered in blood as their mother consoles them with their dying breaths. And that's what really did it for me, was moving beyond the abstractions of numbers and words and looking at what these numbers and words actually meant in a physical, visual sense. And before anyone comes in and says, but Israeli kids die too, yeah, about 1 out of every 20 kids killed in the conflict is Israeli instead of Palestinian. Again, it's just not a meaningful or honest comparison to make. And even if roughly equal amounts of both sides were being killed, it would still make Israel the aggressor. Palestinians are in the process of defending themselves and trying to take back the land that was taken from them 80 years ago. In other words, still in some people's lifetimes. In other words, it's not just a power balance in terms of military might, it's simply the fact that Israel is a subtler colonialist state, fundamentally informed by the incorrect idea of taking land they think is rightfully theirs based on the fact that they lived there 2,000 years ago. Now, is the conflict 100% black and white? No, the idea of nuance is itself complicated. There's levels of nuance to everything. Something is usually not either nuanced or not nuanced, it's a scale of sorts. What really matters is how nuanced something is, and while there is nuance to the conflicts, as far as nuance goes, the Israel conflict is not very nuanced. Yes, Hamas is a far-right, fundamentalist organization that definitely doesn't have the best interests of the Palestinians in mind, and yes, some people who are anti-Israel might be so just because they're anti-Semitic. But this doesn't subtract from the simple fact that Israel has been continuously taking Palestinian land for 70-something years. Of course, yes, any prospect of Palestinians taking back their land would involve Israelis losing some, if not of all, of the land that they currently live on, which would definitely cause at the least a great deal of emotional harm to the Israelis. But modern-day Israelis are profiting every day off of the land that they have taken and continue to take from the Palestinians to this day. And hypothetically, just assuming every Israeli was, say, deported from Israel and made to live on land that they didn't steal, it's not like the US and Europe wouldn't welcome with open arms those hypothetical Israeli refugees and give them probably a lot better treatment than people coming to these places from, say, South America or the Middle East. Of course, then people start talking about how that's a slippery slope. Like, what about Native Americans taking back their own land, or African Americans having their own nation state, or at least getting reparations of some sort? Yes, and maybe some people would have to leave the places they live, but we took the land from what were in many cases peaceful tribes, or in the case of Africans, we took people from their land, and the legacy of these actions have devastated both communities in ways that still exist today. Again, is there zero nuance? No, there's not a great deal, but a little. Did Native Americans fight back sometimes against the people that were taking their land? And did they sometimes murder women or children in the process? I'm sure they did. But the father of that family was usually murdering or displacing Native American families themselves in much larger numbers. And settlers or even the US Army did not shy from brutally murdering Native American women or children either in the hundreds, including, among others, the cases of the Sand Creek Massacre, the Wyatt Massacre, the Bridge Gulch Massacre, the Three Knolls Massacre, the Marius Massacre, the Clear Lake Massacre, the Yontocket Massacre, the Bear River Massacre, and the Camp Grant Massacre, among others. The last one is insanely evil, even by the standards of massacres, and I highly recommend reading about it. Much the same, did slaves sometimes uprise and kill slave owners? Yes, but we took them from their land and used their labor to make our country the way it is today. And just like with the Palestinians, the amount of American whites being killed in these uprisings were a tiny fraction compared to the amount of African Americans being worked to death, or not including also the incredible amount that died just being transported to America. Of course, things can actually be a lot more nuanced, and that sucks because then you have to spend time explaining things. And no one ever wants to explain complex things or have complex things explained to them. I don't want to talk about these things. I wish everyone read about these things and approached them honestly and without prejudice to the best of their abilities. And I wish more of the people who are well read on these things were also more willing to be patient and kind when explaining these things to other people. But neither of these things are the reality. And because of this, people who ostensibly have good contentions quickly start to hate each other. Take the war in Ukraine, for example. Russia is run by a pathetic, evil piece of shit who doesn't care how many lives he has to ruin if it means preserving his own power. But, and there are of course people who really do believe that the Russians are justified in invading, which is wrong. But, the main problem that many critics have with the Ukraine war is not simply that they support the Russians, as many people will smear them for, but that the media is giving this conflict such an incredibly disproportional amount of media coverage, while paying comparatively little attention to the US's assistance of countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia in the continued oppression of the Palestinians in Israel's case, and the incredible genocidal oppression of the Yemenis in Saudi Arabia's case. And all just because it happens to not be the US doing the incredibly evil thing for a change. There are other elements as well. Ukraine has a genuine Nazi problem that goes well beyond just Azov Battalion. In the meantime, they've also banned all of their left-wing parties on the pretext of them cooperating with Russia, while providing not much real evidence for this fact. Also, by continuing to arm Ukraine, you can argue the US is just profiting off a war that seems very unlikely for Ukraine to ever win, causing far more death and destruction than if the US stopped arming Ukraine at all, and worked instead towards diplomacy in order to save lives. Also, given that a large amount of the arms given to Ukraine is apparently not making it to the actual fighters, you can argue that this might lead to another situation like in Iraq or Libya, where US arms end up in the hands of far-right terrorist groups. Again, Putin is easily the greater evil between him and Ukraine, and I think Ukraine has the right to defend itself, as any country should from foreign invasion. But it's sad and kind of disgusting that a country like Ukraine is getting such a disproportionately huge amount of media coverage, since it just so happens to not being America doing the oppressing for a change. Taiwan was occupied by the nationalists in 1949 when they lost the Chinese Civil War against the communists and fled to Taiwan, which was at the time considered part of China, before massacring the indigenous peoples there to establish their own state. Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan is like if during the Civil War, the Confederates fled to Puerto Rico, massacred its people, and established a government there. And then 70 years later, the third highest ranked Chinese official came to Puerto Rico and assured the world that Puerto Rico was its own independent state, even though the US still laid claim to it. Does that mean I'm saying China should invade? No, but again, it's just really depressing to see all the self-righteous indignation on behalf of Taiwan and how much media coverage the recent incident with Nancy Pelosi visiting the country has gotten, compared to atrocities being committed by America both in the past and today. After America has invaded countless countries, after America has taken endless land from Mexico and from the Native Americans, not to mention the countless countries they've cooed and invaded abroad for their own self-interest, to continue to pretend, even today, that they are some kind of noble protectors of democracy on the world stage, just as they have dishonestly pretended to for their entire existence, is really disgusting. Idiots like Nancy Pelosi visiting a country that, according to polls, just wants the status quo, is about America wanting to provoke a war with China so that America can make itself look good on the world stage. That's it. And Americans who pretend to care about Taiwan but don't for all of America's allies that commit atrocities on the daily is also some pretty disgusting hypocrisy. Of course, sadly, anyone who says the Taiwan or Ukraine situation isn't black and white is smeared as a Russia or China simp. And yes, again, there are people who simply are just pro-Russia and China and really do operate off of the America bad, any country that is against it is good principle. But to smear everyone simply saying that we shouldn't unconditionally support the US in these situations, even when it seems black and white, is to completely disregard the US's long history of lying to some extent about their intentions in almost every single war or conflict they've ever entered. In the end, I just wanted to point out a few examples of how we often give nuance to situations that don't really deserve it, while not giving that same credit to other situations that might actually deserve that nuance. There's this phenomenon of people purposely adding nuance to situations just for the sake of nuance, rather than just actually objectively analyzing the situation. And while it often seems to come from a place of goodwill, it's just wrong to do so, because there's a difference between a balanced analysis and an objective analysis. And it's important to understand that the former type of analysis is actually not fair because it seeks to equate two sides that often just are not equal at all costs. It can be hard to understand, of course, what really is an objective analysis at times, I know, but hey, life's complex. Or not?